Welcome everyone, good afternoon, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the afternoon of IML's Virtual Development Day on dealing with the tough stuff. My name is Parminder Sandhu and I'm one of the Corporate Solutions Managers looking after Queensland. Here at IML, Sam has passed on the hosting baton to me and I'll be with you for our next two sessions, and what a great last two sessions we've got for you. So we've had some really interesting insights from Mark and Marnie this morning, and Rupert's going to be delivering coaching skills for leaders, but with a bit of a twist. And I'll let Rupert explain that. Rupert, if you could just change that slide for me so we can just show everyone what we've got coming up after your one.
Whoop.
There we go.
That one.
All right. So we're on what you guys will have down as coaching skills for leaders, but Rupert's just going to do a bit of a twist on that, and you can see the topic title is a little bit different, which is handling conflict in difficult situations using your coaching skills. So I'm really interested to hear more about that. Some reminders for me before we go ahead, and Rupert, if I could ask you to change to the next slide. The action plan. Sam will definitely have mentioned this all to you if you've been joining us for the earlier sessions this morning. At IML, we're all about transferring learning back to the workplace. Really important that we use these action plans. You can see they're all neatly organized for you. You can recap any key learnings, but also make some commitments to behavioral change, which, Rupert, as we know, is really important, and it will help you make the most of what you learned today. You will have received this in an email from us yesterday and this morning. If you haven't, you can get it off our website, but please do use that or just jot some notes down just to make sure that this is a really valuable use of your time. Now for some housekeeping. The content, as per all our webinars, will run for about 45 minutes. We might go a little bit over, but we are going to try and keep some time for a Q&A session at the end. Please keep talking to us in the chat. I'll send a message in a sec. Make sure you've made a note where that is. Rupert might pause the session throughout if he wants any comments or feedback or questions. So please know we're going to try and encourage some participation if we can, and keep it interactive, and hopefully not everyone's feeling that afternoon slump after lunch. Remember, as with all of our webinars and development days, you will get recordings for all the sessions that you register for, and any resources that any of our facilitators mention you can request. You will need to email us. I'll remind you of the email address at the end, but it's info@managersandleaders.com.au. And you'll also have an opportunity to share your feedback when the webinar ends, and I really want to encourage you to do this. It's so important that we find out whether this content was relevant, whether it was practical, useful to you. It makes sure that we can keep putting on the best stuff for you guys to utilize. All right, and now to introduce Rupert. So Rupert has over 15 years of experience in leadership development, HR, consulting and coaching. He's worked with most top 50 ASX companies, but he also really loves exploring new industries and new contexts. And I know Rupert and I have been working closely together on a few of our key corporate clients here in Queensland, which have been an interesting challenge and really rewarding. His highly developed coaching skills have helped many employers fulfill their commitment to achieve greater employee performance and engagement, develop strategic thinking skills, especially with high potential employees. So I think this is going to be a great session. I'll hand over to you now, Rupert, and you just give me a shout if you want to pop back in any questions. And yeah, take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Parminder. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Yeah, good. There was one person in the chat box in the question that said they can't hear you, but I'm hoping they've resolved that by now. I've just noticed it. But if you can hear me, I think most of us should be able to. So thanks very much for the opportunity. That's a bit about me. That's enough about me. I am also a psychologist by trade and want to bring to you perspectives around difficult people, situations and conflict that offer a bit of insight around you and your personal effectiveness. And those situations create I guess sometimes not the best version of yourself. I want to start with you and then move out into others. So we're going to be spending a bit of time on emotions and what's going on for you, and dial into the psychology of effective conversations, and also what does good leadership look like when you're having difficulties. But we've got to start with you. What's your response? What's your reaction? What are you doing and how you're doing it? Hopefully we'll be not just surfacing self-awareness, but also insight. And we'll talk more about that in a second. So here's a summary of some of the things that we will cover. We'll start with personal effectiveness. What do we know about ourselves? What do we need to know? What's going to be really important for us to know? First and foremost about ourselves, and then others second. That's sort of more your psychology, and then their thinking, their emotions, and their behaviours. We'll walk through that model, awareness, insight, and self-regulation. What does that mean, and how does that help you? We'll talk a little bit about the implications to a team and leadership after that. I guess the secret here is we're heading in the direction of how do you maintain a sense of choice and volition in that conversation. It's normally a conversation. This isn't just conflict you're having inside your own head. This is usually with another person, a difficult situation, something you're struggling through, something that's challenging and potentially sort of quite stressful for you. So we'll get into it. There's lots to talk about, and this simple model is very important. It's an important place for us to start to consider, what do we know about ourselves? What's important for us? Well, self-awareness cannot be very effective. It can't lead to change and growth. It can't lead to acquiring your goals or advancing your careers if you don't have insight. And so what we've got there is a simple model of personal effectiveness that gets you to look at, what do I know about myself? And when we put the lens of difficult people, difficult situations, or conflict onto this model of personal effectiveness, you start to see what you know about yourself is really important. You tend to talk over the top, or you tend to interrupt people, or you tend to be far too reticent, pleasing, or passive, or compliant. They're both sort of ends of the extreme when it comes to difficult people and situations. Knowing that's great, but it won't get you to change. It won't get you to your goals. What will is the capacity to look down and in to insight, what I call the underberg of your iceberg. How do you sort of look into why do you tend to do what you do? The key word in there is why, probably should be bolded. Understanding why you think, why you feel, why you behave the way you do. So if you sort of think about that iceberg model, which you would be familiar with, it's most of it's under the surface, that's the metaphor. We consider the assumptions, the beliefs, the biases, the values, and what sits right in the bottom of the belly of that iceberg, that underberg of your iceberg, is your identity. And when your identity is questioned, is fractured, is pushed, then we start to think, feel, and behave in ways that aren't as personally effective. So it's this combination of both self-awareness and insight that gives you that capacity to self-regulate. And the really challenging thing about difficult situations and people where there's conflict, where there's stress, is that we need to hold ourselves to self-regulate well. And self-regulation is what differentiates children from adults, right? And it's what we aspire to do. It's what we teach children to do, is to be able to understand their thoughts and feelings and how they can regulate their behaviour. So when it comes to management and leadership and the display of more effective behaviours in difficult situations, your ability to self-regulate well under pressure is really important. So the formula is simple. Awareness is what you do. Insight is why do I tend to do what I do. Have a reflection upon under pressure. Do you know why you do what you do? When it comes to conflict, difficult situations, difficult people, why do you tend to do what you do? Do you start to recognize some patterns or values or beliefs or assumptions that sit a little bit deeper for you? Just have a think about that for a second. We'll keep going. Adjusting, choosing, changing, flexing is the key, particularly under pressure when it comes to you managing you and maintaining your personal effectiveness. What you know about yourself, why do you tend to do what you do, is really important. We'll get into a little bit of the emotions and the psychology that underpins that in a moment. The other thing that I notice is that in challenging situations, in developing ourselves and growing ourselves as managers and leaders, we don't come into work wanting to have a fight or wanting to be passive or wanting to sort of step away, wanting to overly assert ourselves or have to repeat ourselves, which is often what happens in challenging situations. We often come in with very good intentions. Peter Feuder, one of my favourite authors, a Sydney consultant, sort of talks about judging ourselves by our noble intentions, but what other people see is the actual behaviour. It would be good to consider what's the intention and what's the behaviour they're seeing. What are you currently doing and what would you like to be doing? Or, you know, how are you seeing yourself and how might others be seeing you? Because what we also need to do is make sure it's not just others that are creating this difficult situation, but it might be you that's exacerbating this. So let's consider this from both sides. How do you see yourself? How do others see you? Is it you that's the recipient of these difficult behaviours, or is it you that might be exacerbating them and making it a little bit harder for the other people or teams or situations that are going on for you at work? So the intention behaviour gap is, again, it's a simple model. It's a little bit like the awareness, insight, self-regulation. It's a simple view of considering where do I sit in this situation and how do I offer some sort of objectivity, not be subjected to the challenge of that moment, but how do I look at this more objectively, not subjected to the emotion or subjected to what that person's saying, but remain elevated in that conversation. We'll talk more about how we can do that now, but what we want to do is just dial right into the emotions, into that, I guess, the sort of the soft skill, but really the internal dialogue. What's going on for you in terms of your thoughts, but most importantly, your emotions. We'll have a quick look at some sort of brain science stuff for a second. Well, firstly, what's the purpose of emotions? Why do we have emotions? We don't really stop and think about that too often. Emotions sit deep in our brain, the function of our brain that houses our emotional processing is sort of broadly known as the sort of the limbic centers, and right at the heart of that's the amygdala, which is this filtering device that looks at every single bit and byte that comes into our life. Every piece of data that comes into our life is filtered through our emotional systems first for its emotional loading. Do we like it? Do we not like it? Are we moving toward that? Are we moving away from that? And it can be quite binary. It doesn't have a great capacity for nuance or language. It just sort of is, you know, fear, anger, resentment, or joy or happiness or love or trust. You know, there are positive emotions and there are negative emotions. One of the key challenges for emotions is that there's no great adaptive capacities if you've got strong negative emotions. Contemporary leaders need to demonstrate adaptive leadership, adaptive capacities. The challenges in our work, the challenging people require adaptation, require flexibility, require curiosity. Negative emotions don't really help us adjust or adapt. They just go, you go back into the same old familiar neural pathways. So what emotions, you know, why are they there? What do? They serve a very important purpose. The purpose, you could argue, is a little bit more sort of protection and survival, but it's also moving towards something. What do you like and where are you going and how are you getting there? Sometimes that end of our emotions is sort of underestimated and not well known. So knowing why you do what you do is really important. Emotions can inform us, mobilize, motivate us, and move us toward our chosen goals, our chosen behaviors. So that's really important. You know, emotions when it comes to other people are obviously it's going to be triggered by an environment, and it's important to consider that this doesn't happen in isolation. The emotional patterns that surface rapidly, we push back into our tendencies, we push back into behaviours, and we go back in time when it comes to difficult people, the difficult situations. It's really important that we're aware of those patterns from our past, because it's typically where you'll go when it comes to difficult people or difficult situations. one of the tools that I share with people, which is sort of essentially drawn from psychology, is the idea of perspective and proportion. You know, what we know from psychology or counseling and clinical psychology is that oftentimes we ascribe a level of emotion to a situation that is disproportionate to the event. And that happens a lot. You know, sometimes when we feel like our identity is questioned or we're fronting into a difficult personal situation, we will scale that emotion up well beyond what the actual event or the trigger was. So it's something to look out for. And it's a really important question for you right now to maintain your personal effectiveness about what are you doing, why are you doing it, how do you flex it, how do you grow in the face of challenging situations. That's not easy. I've got a couple of answers to that a little bit later on. But the question is proportion. On a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, is the event actually proportionate to the amount of emotion you are displaying? As leaders and managers, we need to display, we need to behave. People see that emotion, and that's what I'm interested in. It's not so much your internal dialogue or actually how you feel, but what is the display of that emotion? Is it proportionate? If it's a really significant thing, yeah, you're going to have a lot of emotion around it. Sometimes negative emotions, sometimes, you know, frustration and fear and anger. But that's if it's a really significant work event, and that's proportionate. But typically it's not, you know, what we would ascribe as a 50 out of 100 event or a 5 out of 10 event is usually more like a 10 or a 20. So it's just a simple scaling tool to consider that.
Rupert, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've had a few questions through that I thought you might want to answer before we proceed.
Yeah.
Just around that, we've got a few people asking whether this is coaching skills for leaders, and I just wonder whether you wouldn't mind explaining again the slight twist that you're doing in this session, so that people are clear on what they're going to get out of it.
Yes, certainly. I could skip all the way to the end and show you the coaching skills for leaders. The implications for leaders, we are going to be starting with personal effectiveness. You cannot access any coaching skill. You can't listen well, and you certainly can't ask a coaching question, let alone a great question, if you don't know where you're at. It starts with personal effectiveness. That unlocks your ability to listen well and ask good questions. And so we will get to that in a minute. No, it's a fair question, but it's a bit of a leap of faith in terms of where are we at and how do we get into what are the coaching skills that leaders need to be asking, particularly, you know, because the broader frame of the entire day is conflict and difficult people or difficult situations. But what we're going to do is dial into that a little bit later on. But we're going to start with you doing what you need to do individually to ensure you can access that capacity. The thing that I'm alluding to right here is that you are not curious, you're not interested, you're self-protective. If you're in a difficult situation, if you're in conflict with someone, our curiosity goes out the window. There are biological reasons for that. There are quite a range of reasons that we need to be aware of under pressure. Why do we tend to do what we do? Where do we go when we're confronted with something challenging? We don't go into curiosity because your limbic systems are blocking that off. They block off your memory. They block off your planning, your strategy, your whole cerebral functions in your brain get cut off because they're sensing a need to survive. So we will spend a little bit more time on this if that's okay. And I'm also happy to push deeper into the connection between personal effectiveness and good coaching skills for leaders. And I could talk to you about coaching skills for leaders for 3 days non-stop because I think it's an absolutely underutilized and essential topic for us to get the best out of the people around us. Asking a person a question requires curiosity, but we're not going to access that unless we know ourselves well. So yeah, no, I'm glad you jumped in, Pamina, and I'm very happy to keep pushing across to that. I can see some of those questions. no, you're not missing anything just yet. It's just a very important way for us to be able to access those questions. So we'll do a couple more slides on what's going on for us, what's happening physically, psychologically. Our sympathetic nervous systems kick in to protect us when we are in conflict. It's an ancient but essential survival mechanism built deep into our brain and our body, and it's worth noting and noticing what's going on for us if we're really challenged, if we're in genuine sort of conflict, and it creates stress reactions, and our stress reactions are then supported by our sympathetic nervous system, which will change your physiology. It'll push blood down into your legs so you can run off. But you know, that requirement for us in workplaces, you know, we stopped needing that, you know, a few thousand years ago, really, but we still have it built deep into our brain. If we don't know why we're having physiological responses, emotional responses, and even thinking responses, they end up happening to us. When you know a little bit about your physiology under pressure, you can notice that your heart might be racing, or you might even be talking too much or too fast. There are things going on for you which are really your sympathetic nervous system kicking in to sort of protect you. And when you're in conflict, when you're in difficulty, you do need that. You need some level of maintaining, it's not, the resistance to that threat, but it's more the ego threat or the social threat that's arising for you. So what we'll do, we'll just spend a little bit more time on this and then start to sort of push into what do we need to know for us to then maintain our personal effectiveness and then land that question, which is going to help us resolve for this. Emotions happen to us, you know. Emotions, we don't really choose our emotions. Noting your emotional processing style really means looking back at the pattern, and if you tend to, you know, fight or sulk or have a tantrum when you're a kid, often you bring that into your adulthood, or more sophisticated adult versions of that, of course. But we do tend to either internalize our emotions and sort of shut down, or externalize our emotions and take it out on others. And that's two very broad categories, I know, but it's really important to dial into the positive emotions that drive you forward and help you move into that sort of developmental discomfort or tension of being able to resolve a conflict or a difficulty, noting what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you do it. Negative emotions have no adaptive capacity, as I was saying before. So, why is this important? Well, our emotions drive our thinking drives our behaviours or our actions. And that's a simple summary of what I've been talking about that will enable us. So, a couple more things. Self-management, so you can then manage others. So you can then manage the environment, the situation, the input. You can maintain your flexibility. The thing that we're looking for to be able to be a good leader in difficult situations or with people is to maintain our cognitive flexibility and our emotional agility. They're sort of borrowed, the emotional agility idea is borrowed from Susan David, who's a fabulous author in that space, got a bunch of TED Talks and some Harvard Business Review articles, and he's got a bunch of books, and is really worth looking up. If you like the idea of emotional agility, how do we stay flexible with our emotions? How do we bounce back? There's a lot further reading, but that author's worth considering, Susan David. So what we're looking for here to regulate well is change. Thinking changes. What you need to let go of and stop. The patterns that you need to identify. Why don't we change? It takes real discipline to do things under pressure in new ways is not what we feel like doing. What we need to look for is the positive emotional outcome or the positive developmental tension of moving toward resolving are challenging, usually with another person or sometimes group of people, we need to move toward what's our chosen goal and what's our chosen set of values that we want to display in that difficult situation. What good leaders do under pressure is they're purposeful. They're not really self-serving. They understand that there needs to be an outcome to the discussion, that they need to balance the people and task side of that conversation. In other words, to connect, to understand, to listen, to learn, with the outcome and what you're trying to achieve from that conversation. But the center pillar in that balance, in those two things, is purpose. What's the purpose of the conversation? What's the purpose of this organization? Some bigger picture questions that drag you up and out of what I called your underberg, of your iceberg, and help you look forward and upward into why are we having this conversation from a more purposeful point of view, from something that's above you and above them. And that's a good reminder, and it's a real prompter. And just the word, you know, purpose. What is the purpose of this conversation? How is it helping us get a bit of better business outcome? Because you guys are managers and leaders, and we're talking about this in a workplace context, okay? So one more slide on emotions, and then I promise we're going to be pushing into the, where are the coaching skills, and what do they look like? What we need to be aware of in ourselves and in others is the strong physiological, emotional, and thinking that happens, and it happens to us when we're under pressure. As I said before, emotions are there to move us. Emotions are about the mobilization, the movement, what creates motivation for you. I mean, we have motivation to avoid and to move, but the key thing here is that all of those emotions that sit on the, I assume it's the left side of your screen there, fear, anger, disgust, etc., are driven by cortisol and adrenaline and other chemicals in our brain, and they don't have any adaptive capacities to them whatsoever. What helps us sit in that challenge is staying in the surprise. When there's something new, when there's something questioning you, when there's something worrying you, when there's something you are concerned about, it's often you know, a social threat, an ego threat, a job threat. It's not a real threat that we're talking about here, but it's still a thing that some data or some input or something's coming to us that we need to respond, that we want to manage our reactions, our reactive tendencies, but also move into how do we stay in the, hey, this is new, what's the potential? And what kids do really well, other than self-regulate, is that they tend to wonder. They tend to be curious. They tend to stay curious. You know, and it's sort of other institutions that help us lose our curiosity. Help is a generous word, but you know, in bureaucracies, in larger organisations, in governments, schools, sometimes you know, we don't always stay curious. What we do know from kids is our wonderment and our curiosity is the start place for moving towards something that you are looking to resolve and move through from an emotional perspective. You do not burn out on serotonin, adrenaline, oxytocin, but you do burn out on cortisol and adrenaline. In fact, it'll kill you eventually. So those, you know, just noting there are no adaptive capacities and a series of chemicals and hormones that will shut you down and stop you, and, you know, through escape and avoidance, particularly under pressure. But the thing I like about this model that's really important is, you know, what do emotions do for you? How do they serve you well? It's staying in the potential, in the wonderment, in the curiosity that will drive you to connect and engage and collaborate, particularly under pressure, because you don't want to do that typically. You want to self-preserve, self-protect. And that doesn't get that does not help us get a great business outcome through preserving, protecting. There are under pressure a lot of people that know how to stay in their lane, stay in their silo, stay focused on just what they do, or even keeping their job. but keeping your job and doing your job, let alone leading well, are very different things. So moving toward what's possible, what are you excited about? How do you build trust, attachment, connection, collaboration? These are the skill set of the future leader, or the current leader as well, for that matter. This is a really important skill set for us. Good little model for us to consider there. The Brown guy, his name's Paul Brown, Professor Paul Brown. It'd be worth looking up if you like the idea of how do emotions inform us, and what's the positive, adaptive, constructive, useful end of emotions, and how do we access them? It's through the brain's highest function, creativity and curiosity. So what I wanted to do is just sort of pause there, just at the critical moment, because we are going to start to talk next about team leadership and coaching skills, and we'll get to that in a second. But what I wanted to do is just get you to pause on your personal effectiveness under pressure. You're welcome to pop in a question there, or even make a comment. Just going to pause for a minute, get you to consider awareness, insight, self-regulation. What do we know about ourselves? What's the intention? What's the actual behaviour? What do we need to know about our emotions under pressure? If you've got any questions or comments there, I'm just going to be silent for a second for you to consider that, and then we're going to push into the next sort of step, okay?
Rupert, I've come back on just to help you field those questions, so we'll give people a couple of minutes to put their feedback or thoughts in. I actually just wanted to share a couple of things. I know this is a bit of a twist into what people were expecting, and I know we will get to the coaching skills, but what's really resonated with me is that how can you be in that coaching mindset to be productive and collaborative if you're upset, if you're angry, if underneath the surface you're actually your mind isn't there at all.
Yeah.
And I think often we rush as leaders to, where's the template? Where's the questions? How do I quickly go and fix this? And it kind of forgets that coaching in itself is, that mindset is actually more important than the specific questions or the process.
Absolutely, Parminder, I agree. You just can't access it. You know, what great leaders do is they use and they lift people up into the critical information for good decision making. And if you're not curious, if you're not engaged, if you're not connected, if you're self-protecting and self-preserving, escaping, avoiding, detaching, you know, you can't be an effective leader. But it starts with the brain's highest functions, creativity and curiosity. And sometimes under pressure, you've got to just fake it, just ask a question. And we'll get into that in a minute. But you know, there's lots of different ways to access that. One is noting where you're at, managing your emotions and being highly aware and insightful. But the other is, even if you're not curious, just pretend to be curious, because that will kickstart that more high functioning part of your brain to sort of go, what's possible here? Or why are we talking about this? But the key thing is, you're not going to want to feel like that. In the moment, you're going to want to feel like you need to self-preserve, self-protect, assert, aggress, retract, hide, run, fight, flight, freeze, right? Because that's what our brain's built around that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think even, I'm just going to turn off my webcam just in case there's any issues with sound, but I'm still got a few comments coming in. What I just on that Rupert, something I really liked, and it's from Susan David, who you mentioned, something that really resonated with me. She says emotions are directives, are data and not directives. And that just blew me away. I always was, well, if I feel upset, then something must be wrong. If I feel angry, something must be wrong. But actually, it's more of a guide to look more inward. And yeah, I must go do something about that now. Okay, so we've got Jenny who's saying, Jenny's actually given some great feedback on, she understands where you're going and she thinks it's brilliant, so thank you. And also that she also caves in under pressure and loses a
I've lost a bit of your voice. Yeah, the voice dropped out there, Parminder. Not sure if that's just at my end or yours.
She feels there's much to learn from this approach. Umar's actually got an interesting question that what do you do when you work in an organization when emergencies are really common? I think that's a really interesting point. If you work in a quite a volatile environment, say healthcare, or if you work in the fire service, things like that, where you're almost always in quite tense situations. And I'll just give you another couple, just from Alicia, saying that understanding how to manage emotions is key to know how to coach as a leader. Leaders have a responsibility to motivate, engage, and inspire others. Completely agree with that, Alicia. And then we've got one saying that, which I think is a great way of talking about coaching, that coaching conversations are life-giving. And if it's seen as a task to get over and done with, it stifles innovation and problem solving. And I love that lens. So I'll leave those with you, and I'll be back on later on.
Oh, I love it. Thank you for your summary there, Parminder. And yeah, life-giving. What a beautiful thing for us to be able to do for our teams, for our staff. It is life-giving. It's growth-inducing. But you don't get into that without some sort of attachment, some sort of open disclosure, or even display of your emotions, of where you're at. And I guess we are spending a bit of time on this, but I will move forward. But what we can do to be much more than some of our parts, and the reason why human beings live in cities and not in caves, is that we are more than the sum of parts. We can solve complex problems much better together than individually, right? So trust and connection is really important. The generosity that you need to deliver to lift and inspire and engage your teams starts with curiosity. It starts with good listening and good questions. So we'll get into that now, and happy to keep my eye on that, and I'll keep I'll keep an eye on that question about when you're in a culture that is about emergencies, and it might be the police or the ambulance, or when it's in just simply a more reactive culture. How do you start to nudge that system, nudge that culture forward? Well, it starts with you. The extent to which are you aware of, are you reacting, or are you responding? And what do you know about your emotions and how you display those emotions? What's important to you and where are you going? I would start with the personal effectiveness and then move into team effectiveness, organizational culture, in that order, because that's what good leaders do. The journey to leadership effectiveness is through self-awareness, when you know yourself well. So let's just move on and talk about the implications for teams. I mentioned teams and coaching skills at the start, and you might be familiar with this. This is a very well-known framework by an author called Patrick Lencioni, who talks about the 5 dysfunctions of team. I've just, to put it a little bit neater and nicer, made it the 5 functions of a team. And what can really sort of get in your way here is trust. We've left off on trust. Love, I know, is a very soft word, but we left off on trust with that Paul Brown 8 basic emotions framework before. But if we don't have trust, we can't move into productive conflict. And we're talking about difficult conversations and how you manage yourself well. We won't have openness and directness. We won't have conversations, be it one-on-one or in a team setting, that enable us to feel heard, not just be heard, but to feel heard. And your ability as a leader to facilitate diverse, different, dissenting input that enables for a robust set of view, and different sort of set of views, we can't then get into commitment. So people will not commit as a group, as a team, as an organization, if they don't sort of feel heard, if they don't believe that they were heard. They will not commit to the actions, the goals, the direction that you are taking them. And therefore, when you ask them, have they done it or have they not done it, they're like, oh, no, that was your idea, not mine. It's like, no, but we talked about that. It's like, well, I wasn't heard. So you go back down that pyramid there. And the 5 functions pyramid is a really helpful tool to start thinking about challenging situations and how you can lead and lift, inspire and engage with your teams. You just simply, at the top of the pyramid there, you won't get the results. You won't get what you are looking for as an organisation if you don't start with trust. And trust starts with how are you moving toward building collaboration, connection, engagement. How are you aware of what you do, why you do it, how you do it? You won't get there. So it starts with trust, and then it moves into real open debate and conversation, because as leaders and managers, our job is not just to create psychological safety, which is essential, as you know, and that's a whole nother workshop. Our job is to also create places where people not just sort of go, well, it's safe to speak up. Well, what does that mean? That means, was it not safe at some stage? I'm a bit over that. I actually think that that's relevant, and but it's outlived its usefulness. I think we need to create brave spaces, places of courage, places where people actually speak up and speak directly and don't stand by, but they offer opinions and views, because you as the leader have created a space for them to demonstrate their courage. What happens instead? Two broad things that I've already alluded to in teams and in broader dynamics than just the interpersonal one or the intrapersonal one, which we've been focusing on at the start. Team members either seek harmony over real constructive debate and difference in conversation, or they seek to be right and win and fix, and that can really get in our way. They're not looking for valuable input, they're looking for their input. And so you have those that are move against people in team situations, or move away from people in team situations because they're just trying to keep the peace, be passive, compliant, fit in, get along, right? And that's where we can get overwhelmed. And when you know what your style is like in a team, when you know what your leadership style is like as the leader of that team, you can seek to put those things together and reverse the overuse of consensus or harmony, and bring in constructive conversations that help us overcome conflict and be better leaders of our teams. And if we don't, you have these meetings where people sort of sit around passively, aggressively, where people back channel everything, where they say things like, well, some of my favorites I've been talking about recently, where people sort of chuck you on the bus. They say, oh, I'd like to challenge that. And then they have a crack at a person. The overuse of I'd like to challenge that, look out for that, please. I think that's manipulative. Because what happens is you then challenge the person, they're humiliated, and da-da-da. So it just gets sort of worse. There was another one I heard about the other day around, what's framed up as a challenge to sort of push in and offer a different view, but ends up being a bit more of something that's personally directed toward the other person. And I guess we sort of overuse those expressions a little bit, just something to look out for there. We don't get into the controversial topics. We don't really tap into the diverse views and opinions. We've wasted time and energy, and we're spending time more protecting our jobs, keeping our jobs, not doing our jobs, as leaders. And the job of a leader is people and purpose and performance, not one or the other. We don't take that sort of interpersonal risk required, that you were not aware of the developmental tension that we need to move toward, because you don't want to move toward. You don't want to be curious. You're there protecting. So what we've learned from Lencioni and the 5 dysfunctions of a team framework in terms of that team dynamic is, to have lively, interesting meetings where people do feel a little bit activated in a really positive way. We need to have trust, then debate, then commitment in that order. We need to get all the ideas from our team members, harness and harvest the very best. We can solve problems far quicker, minimize politics, and get the real sort of, elephant in the room, get the stuff on the table that does need to be discussed in team settings. The other thing that gets in our way as leaders, and this is where we start to frame up as leaders, what do we need to be doing to start to coach. What does the coaching skills look like? Well, what we talked about is you won't have a coaching bone in your body if you are in fear, conflict, anger, resentment, whatever it is. You'll be fighting and fighting, protecting and defending, and you won't be able to do anything like coach or get into the subtle art of good coaching skills for leaders under pressure with difficult people. And that's what I want to bring together, is those two things. It's not just what a good coaching skills for leaders look like, but how do you do this with some sort of challenge or stress or pressure or a difficult person? How do you coach a difficult person? We'll get to a bit of that. So it starts with listening. If you can't listen, you're not going to be able to ask a good question. If you can't ask a good question, you can't coach and you can't lead. And so it starts right there. Why don't we listen? What do we do instead of listening? I've got the answers on the next slide. Just have a think about that for a minute. Whilst you're doing that, I just brought that question. What are your top 3 tips for creating brave spaces? Really good question. You can type into the question box your answers to those ones. What do we need to do that creates uniquely brave spaces? Spaces where people feel confident to not just go, well, it's safe or it's no longer unsafe, but how do you help people find their courage? Well, it sort of starts with self-awareness. Where do they tend to go? Where do I tend to go as a leader? Would be where I'd start. Where do you go under pressure? And what does courage look like for me, for you, and for us? And when you start to sort of talk about the constructs or the definitions of brave or courage or directness, you know, that's where you start to develop your own definitions within your teams. So what do we do instead of listening? Why don't we learn? Well, I said before, you know, your curiosity goes out the window when we're under pressure. And if we can't listen, we can't ask good questions. So what we do under pressure, when we've got someone that we're in some level of conflict with, we end up reloading. You know, you just get the info you need and you punch straight back. We end up listening to we manipulate or pretend to listen because we just want to win. We want to be right. Being right and the feeling of rightness gets mixed up with the technical, are you right or are you wrong? You know, it's a feeling that drives this necessity to win, sometimes fix as well. But the feeling of rightness often gets confused with what's factually correct or not. We want to prove that we're right. We want to get into the data that, you know, cuts out their view. And the intention is to get the person to give up on what they think or feel so you can be right. And so I often think, well, if you're right, does that mean someone else has to be wrong? Or can we all be right? Often that is not the case. Often if you're in there listening to win, it's you're right and someone else, therefore, you know, must be wrong. We listen to fix as well. So we fix, we reload, we win. That's part of your job sometimes. Certainly fixing is part of your job, but it doesn't help us be great coaches. Part of what I talked about before, right at the start, was the heart of resolving difficult situations with people, either in one-on-one, if you want to call it coaching skills in that one-on-one setting or in a team setting that we've talked about before. It really comes down to one thing for me, and that is the key motivational theory that we know about. The foundation of motivation for human beings is called self-determination theory. And when you take self-determination, when you take autonomy, when you take mastery, when you take control off people in a challenging situation, they're going to react like the two groups of people in society that don't have much choice. And if you want them to act like children or prisoners, then take choices away from them. But when we can infuse our conversations and our leadership with choice and volition and opportunity, that's where you start having really good coaching conversations, and your questions and your listening isn't skewed into winning or fixing, or into trying to prove a point or get them to do something or hold them to account. You'll have a much more responsive person sitting in front of you, usually in one-on-one settings, because we're talking about what's the process of alignment and how do you transfer ownership, and how do you sit in one-on-ones, sometimes with a difficult person, not just with a person who wants to develop, because coaching for development is a different discussion. I'm coming at this from, what do we need to know about ourselves and emotions so we can then have good, effective coaching skills in those moments? And what do leaders need to do to coach well? Give them choice. Don't shut their choices down. To a degree, it's the difference between old school management, which was about command and control, about measuring, managing, monitoring, the essential building blocks of business. But more contemporary leadership suggests that we need to be infusing the conversation with choice so they lift up into that choice, not you push down into what they should be doing and where they should be doing it. So, one of the tips in there, is obviously looking for options, but never saying no is really important. Not saying no enables you to just refocus and realign and connect. What are they thinking and saying? How are you listening? How are you learning to sort of step in and inhabit their view, harvest the very best of their view, and connect it into the organizational objectives? That's the real nuance in coaching skills for leaders, particularly in difficult situations. Harvesting their view, connecting it into and aligning it to the strategic objectives through questions like this. Invite them. The micro skill of invitation and permission is really sort of underscored by a simple model that you might have seen before. The funnels are used for lots of different things, sales funnels, water, but essentially the funnel here is about what's the sequence and the flow and how would it work, and if you were working with someone, you're leading them, I guess, and it's a coaching approach to managing a slightly difficult situation. Setting and agreeing on the context is key. And sometimes it's not about debate or what do you want to talk about, what I'm here to talk to you about, but sort of going, here's what we're talking about, get into it. But try and get some sort of agreement about, is that right? Is that, what you're looking for? Is that going to help? Or then where you start to push choice into the conversation and people start to step in, invariably, they will answer positively. I know some of the questions that are going to come through. It's like, what if you ask them? What if you invite them to go, hey, you got 5 minutes to just talk through a little issue I spotted back there. It's a problem, right? Now, naturally you want to go, well, what if they say no? Most adults don't say no. What they'll do is they'll go, if you genuinely invite and seek permission and you go, can I have a chat to you about this? And you've got that intonation of curiosity and choice, they will step into the conversation. And it starts with, how are you going and what's happening and tell me about that. A genuinely open question, again, sets the tone for sort of self-awareness, not your awareness. This isn't feedback. This is coaching skills for leaders in difficult situations. And so you set up the open question and then move into whatever they're giving you, you push straight back at them. You push it back to go. So, if it's something difficult, like you're expecting something and it wasn't delivered, what do you know about that? Or when you say that wasn't on time, what do you mean by that? And you get into the actual whatever they're giving you. So that's where you push back and probe. And whilst probing is my favorite word, I think the probing question really is using their exact words and pushing that back to them. And then starting to generate options, which again empower them. So what do you want to do about it? So the problem or the setting the context and getting into the challenge of that personal situation is really, the first, second, third, sort of 4 steps there. And when you start to push into solutions, it's not until you get halfway down that funnel and you go, well, what do you want to do? Again, you're empowering a person. When you least feel like being curious, when you don't really want to listen, when you don't want to ask questions, you're actually doing something quite counterintuitive with the difficult person, and that is asking them for options. Then the rest is easy, or should be. This is why you came, this slide here. If you're really interested in what does the range, what does coaching skills for leaders look like with difficult people or difficult situations, it's pull questions, it's not push questions. That's the answer. This range of questions really gets us to consider where is our start point here and how are we moving up and down this continuum. Are we pushing, suggesting, telling, or are we asking and using that funnel to sort of create self-awareness, to think about insight, why, with ourselves and with them? You'll have a very different conversation if you can use those pull questions and move up that continuum toward pull questions. I did talk about, last night I had a peer coaching conversation where I work with some coaches, and where you talk about how you can improve your practice as an executive coach. And we talked about that, what looks to me to be a bit ridiculous there, witnessing and silence. But we sort of talked about the power of that. Sometimes when you ask a good question and you give them a bit of extra space, this is right at the top of that continuum of pull, of observing. It's not passive silence, sort of, twiddling your thumb and staring in the air. It's actually give a question and then step back from that question, enable them to think through some sort of active silence. Sometimes it means averting your eye contact, and other times it means sort of looking at them to sort of go, I'll leave that with you. So there is power and value in every one of these steps. Right from suggesting a goal through to just observing, witnessing, and a bit of silence and a bit of room and permission for them to actually answer that question, particularly if they're being difficult. That is the heart of it, is choice and volition, is being able to consciously, because you're now self-aware and insightful, being able to consciously move up and down that continuum, to be able to access your curiosity, to be able to lift and inspire and engage. And there's more lifting and engaging at the top end of the pull part of that continuum, that range, than there is down the bottom, because you sort of do the thinking for them at the bottom. Hey, you should do this, sort of coaching, but not really. I just spotted Anna's question there. How do you coach and create alignment with a group as opposed to one-on-one? There's some really important emerging literature, evidence, and some models around team coaching. I had a conversation with a guy called Martin Echevarria, who's a global expert on this, who sort of talks about team coaching, collaboration. There's some great resources. I'd love to be able to answer that for you in 2 minutes or less, but I wouldn't. But I think the other resource, or I can make that available for you. But Martin Echevarria wrote a book called Enabling Collaboration that I was just talking about a couple of days ago. That's really powerful. That sort of sets up good team coaching. And team coaching is about facilitating questions that all of the group can answer. Not what is your silo think about this problem, but every question needs to be able to be answered by every individual. So it's often about team cohesion, and it's the work of the team and the relationships is 50%, and the work of what's the actual work you're doing is the other 50%. And if that ratio isn't balanced out on regular occasions, you just start talking about the tasky stuff and not focus on what's the interpersonal dynamic and what's the discomfort and what are the emotions that we need to be talking about to be connected, cohesive, and performing as a team. Now, there is a lot to talk about in team coaching, but some really good emerging literature. Paul Lawrence, Dr. Paul Lawrence, is another guy that's got some great work on the foundations of team coaching.
Hi, Rupert. I thought I'd just jump in to let you know we've got precisely 1 minute left, but I think you only got one slide left.
Yeah, that's the summary slide to set the context, invitation, permission, choice is key, self-awareness, transfer that ownership over, the 2 U's. What do you think you should do? Suggests a lot of shift in ownership, so you don't have the monkey on you. and give it time. You know, behaviour shift takes time, particularly when you're coaching individuals that are a bit more problematic. But yeah, that's it for me. Lots of sort of content ideas there, a few potential resources to follow up on, but I'll hand back over to you. And heaps of questions in there. Sorry, I haven't been able to get to all of them, but I hope this gives you a little teaser and some thoughts about coaching skills for leaders, but how you manage you so you can be a good coach.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Fantastic session, Rupert. And yeah, lots of content to unpack. For those of you who have sent questions that we haven't been able to get to, I didn't want to interrupt you mid-flow, Rupert, and it was so interesting. We'll try and get Rupert to answer some of those directly. So what's up next? Hopefully you can all join us for our 4th and final session with Grant Witherington at 2 p.m. That's on how to have difficult conversations with your boss. Which I'm sure we've had to have one of those, most of us have had to have one of those before. If you want to see more of Rupert in action, he's actually doing our next webinar on the 14th of July on how to build trust as a leader, which will be a great session. You can book into that on our website. He's also actually the lead facilitator for our Queensland based Accelerate program, which we run from our Brisbane office. And we're actually still taking enrollments for our next cohort on the 20th of July. So a little plug for you there. You can book all of those things and find out more information on our website. Resources you need to request, please look at those email addresses on the bottom of that slide. Just request them for this session and the recordings will be automatically sent to you. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much, Rupert, and hopefully I'll see you guys on the next one, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Parminder.